Selene did not cry when Caden looked at her like she was a stranger. She stood in the middle of the great hall, her hands steady at her sides, her chin level, while the man she had given 4 years of her life to turned his back on her without even a flinch. The fire in the hearth crackled, the wolves around her held their breath. And Caden, alpha of the Iron Peak pack, said the words she had been dreading since the moment she had first smelled that woman on him. "I am releasing you from your position. You are no longer my Luna." The words landed like a stone dropping into still water. The ripple moved through the room fast, faces shifting from shock to pity to something worse than pity, satisfaction. Some of them had known before she did. She could see it in the way they would not meet her eyes. Selene's name had meant something in Iron Peak. She was a healer, the best the pack had seen in 2 generations. She had mended broken bones, guided difficult births, sat with the dying through long nights when no one else would. She had done all of that while standing beside Caden as his Luna, managing the tensions that came with running a large pack, smoothing over the rough edges of his authority with her own steady presence. She had been good at it. She had believed in it. And now she stood in this hall, surrounded by people she had served with her whole heart, and not one of them moved toward her. Caden did not look cruel as he said it. That was the part she would think about later, in the dark and the cold. He did not look angry or triumphant. He looked tired, and somewhere beneath that exhaustion, he looked relieved, as if he had been waiting to put something heavy down, as if she had been the thing he was tired of carrying. Selene had seen Lyra the week before. The woman had arrived wrapped in a wool coat 3 sizes too large for her small frame, her face pale, her dark eyes wide with something between fear and wonder. She was human, fragile in the way that made wolves instinctively want to shelter her. Selene had assumed she was a refugee from a border village, someone Caden had taken in out of duty. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about a lot of things. She did not argue. She did not beg. That was never who she was, and she refused to let this moment make her into someone smaller than she already felt. She looked at Caden for a long moment, long enough to memorize what his face looked like now, after everything, so she would never mistake it for something it was not again. Then she turned and walked out of the hall. The night air hit her like cold water. She kept walking, through the courtyard, past the training grounds, past the row of small houses where pack families slept unaware of what had just happened inside those stone walls. She did not let herself feel it yet. She could not afford to, not here, not where anyone could see her. She went to the room she shared with Caden, and she did not touch a single thing that was his. She took her healer's bag. She took the thick cloak her mother had given her the day she first came to Iron Peak. She took the small wooden box where she kept dried herbs and tinctures she had made herself. She took nothing else. She was at the edge of the territory when the pain arrived. It came from somewhere deep inside her chest, not a wound you could see or dress. The bond between a Luna and her alpha was not merely emotional. It was biological, woven into the body over time like thread through cloth. When it broke, it did not snap cleanly. It tore. And the tearing was something she had no words for. Nothing in her healer's knowledge that could have prepared her for the white-hot unraveling of it. She dropped to one knee, at the base of a pine tree, and pressed her fist against her sternum, and breathed. Just breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she told her patients to breathe when the pain was too large to think through. She stayed like that for several minutes, maybe longer. The trees were quiet, around her. Somewhere above her, a single owl called once and went silent. When she stood again, she was still in pain, but she was standing. She had made it half a mile past the border when she heard footsteps behind her, light and unhurried. She turned, one hand moving instinctively toward the small blade she kept in her boot. It was Elder Brant, the oldest member of the Iron Peak pack, a lean and weathered man who had outlived 3 alphas, and spoke with the unhurried certainty of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. He did not offer her sympathy. She was grateful for that. "You should know where you are going," he said, falling into step beside her, as though they were simply taking an evening walk. "North," she said. It was the only direction that felt right. Away from Iron Peak, away from anything that smelled like Caden. "North is a big place," Brant said, "but there is a territory there unlike anything you have seen. The Whitecrest Domain. It has stood for longer than any pack currently living can remember. The wolf who leads it has been called many things over the years. He paused, and she felt his gaze on the side of her face. They call him the White Wolf King. She had heard that name before, in the way you hear stories that feel more like legend than fact. A king without equal. A wolf so old and so powerful that other alphas did not challenge him out of strength, but simply out of wisdom. He was not mythical, he was real, but he felt as distant as the stars. Why would he take me in? She asked. Because Whitecrest has not had a healer in 11 years, Brant said simply. And because I knew his grandmother, once, long ago. She told me that when the white wolf finally found his match, she would arrive from the south in winter, with nothing but her hands and her purpose. He stopped walking. She turned to look at him. His old eyes were steady on her face. I never told Caden that story. I am glad I waited. She stared at him. He held her gaze without apology. Go north, he said. Walk until the pines thin and the snow gets deep. You will know the border when you find it. They will be watching before you even arrive. He turned and walked back toward Iron Peak, without another word, his footsteps fading into the dark. Selene stood at the edge of the road for a moment, her bag over one shoulder, the cold pressing in from all sides. She thought about Caden's face. She thought about the hall full of people who had not moved. She pulled her cloak tighter and turned north. She walked through the rest of that night and through the next day, stopping only to rest when her legs demanded it. She had enough dried food in her bag to last 2 days, and the water from the streams she crossed was clean. She was a wolf. She had endured hard things before. She told herself this repeatedly, not to be brave, but because it was simply true, and she needed to remember things that were true. On the second night, she came to the edge of a forest, so dense and dark that the moonlight barely reached the ground through the canopy. The air changed there. It was colder, sharper, carrying the scent of something ancient. Pine and stone and snow and, underneath it all, something she had no name for. Something that made every instinct in her body go very, very still. She stepped forward anyway. She had barely made it 20 steps into the trees when she heard them. Not a sound exactly, a presence. The awareness that she was being watched by more than one set of eyes, all of them intelligent, all of them holding back. She stopped and kept her hands visible at her sides. She did not reach for her blade. My name is Selene Dawnheart, she said to the dark. I am a healer. I have come from Iron Peak. I am not here to cause trouble. I am asking for sanctuary. Silence. Then a low, measured voice came from somewhere above and to her left. We know who you are. She did not flinch. She looked up toward the sound and saw the outline of a wolf in human form seated on a broad branch 10 feet above the ground, watching her with complete calm. Young, maybe her age, with sharp eyes and the kind of stillness that came from years of training. One of the border guards. You have been walking for 2 days, the voice said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. A pause. Then the sound of someone dropping from the tree and landing without so much as a crunch of snow. The guard stood and looked at her for a moment, then turned and jerked his chin in a direction she could not quite make out. Come, he said. The king is awake. She followed him into the dark, toward something she could not yet see but could already, in some part of herself she did not fully understand, already feel. The gates of Whitecrest were not what she expected. She had imagined something imposing, the kind of fortified structure that announced power loudly, the way Iron Peak's great walls had always announced Caden's. But the entrance to Whitecrest was made of dark wood and old iron, worn smooth by decades of weather, with carvings along the frame that told stories she did not have the knowledge to read yet. It was old, in a way that felt alive, like the rings inside a tree that has survived 100 storms. The guard who had led her through the forest handed her off at the gate without a word, and a woman took his place. Tall, lean, with short dark hair, and eyes that moved over Selene with the swift efficiency of someone trained to assess threat in seconds. She found none, and her posture did not exactly relax, but it changed slightly. Astrid, the woman said. Just her name, offered without warmth or hostility. Beta of Whitecrest, I will take you to the king. Selene followed her through a courtyard that was quiet in the deep of night, past a building that smelled of the sick and the healing, past a long, low structure where she could hear the deep, even breathing of sleeping wolves. The pack was large. She could feel the weight of it. the accumulated life of many people layered into the soil and the stones of this place over many years. The building Astrid led her to was not the largest in the compound, but it stood apart from the others at the end of a straight path, with a single light burning in a window on the ground floor. Astrid knocked twice, pushed the door open, and stepped aside. "He will see you alone," she said. Selene walked in. The room was spare and warm. A fire in the grate, a long table with maps spread across it, a shelf of books along one wall, a chair in the corner where a man sat with a cup of something steaming in his hands, watching her come through the door with the quiet attention of someone who had been expecting her and was in no hurry to pretend otherwise. He was not what she had imagined either. Eirik Vane was older than her, clearly, but not in a way that announced itself. There were lines around his eyes and at the corners of his mouth, the kind earned by a life spent in weather and in thought, not by age alone. His hair was white, not the white of old age, but something starker, like birch bark or fresh snow, and it was cut simply, away from a face that was calm, in a way that made her think of deep water, calm at the surface because of what lay beneath it, not because there was nothing there. His eyes were silver. She had heard that about him, but the description had not prepared her for the way they moved over her, not with curiosity exactly, but with recognition, as though he were confirming something he had already known. He did not stand. He did not make a show of his authority. He simply looked at her and said, in a voice that was low and even, and gave nothing away unnecessarily, "You are not here by accident." She had told herself, on the long walk north, that she would be practical, that she would offer her skills clearly and ask for nothing more than shelter and fair work in exchange. She had rehearsed the words. Standing in this room, looking at this man, all of those prepared words left her completely. "No," she said, "I am not." He studied her for another moment. Then he set his cup down on the table beside him and leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You are a healer," he said. "One of the best you will find," she answered, and she was not boasting. It was simply the truth, and she had learned not to diminish it. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, but a recognition. "I know," he said. "Whitecrest has not had a skilled healer in over a decade. I have 6 wolves in the infirmary right now, that my best efforts have not been enough to help." He paused. "I will offer you shelter, meals, full standing within the pack, and my personal protection. In exchange, I ask that you practice your work freely and completely." She waited, because in her experience, there was always something else. "That is the whole of it," he said, reading her silence with an ease that was slightly unnerving. "I do not trade in debts or conditions. If you choose to leave, you leave. If you choose to stay, you stay. The choice is always yours." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Caden saying that she was released, as though she had been a possession being returned. She thought about the hall full of people who had watched and said nothing. "All right," she said. Eric nodded once, as though this was settled, and called for Astrid to show Selene to her quarters. As Selene reached the door, his voice came from behind her, quiet and without ceremony. "You walked 2 days with a broken bond wound, and you are still standing," he said. "That is not a small thing." She stopped. She did not turn around. "It is not," she agreed. And then she walked out into the cold corridor and followed Astrid through the dark toward a room she had never seen before, in a place she did not yet know, and for the first time in 4 years, she let herself feel, just slightly and very carefully, something that resembled the first edge of peace. She slept without dreaming that night. She had not done that in longer than she could remember. In the morning, she went to the infirmary. The 6 wolves Eric had mentioned were in various states of trouble. 2 had suffered injuries that had healed wrong and needed careful work to correct without causing further damage. 1 was a young female struggling with a fever that had lasted too many days. 2 others had a lung ailment that was responding poorly to the treatment they had been given. The last was an elderly male, sharp-eyed despite his weakness, who looked at Selene when she entered and said, "Finally," with such relieved conviction that she had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. She worked all day. Astrid appeared at mid-morning, stood in the doorway, watched for a while without comment, and then disappeared. She reappeared at midday with food that she left on a small table near the door without a word. Selene ate it without stopping work. By evening, All 6 patients were more stable than they had been that morning. The elderly male was sitting up. The young female's fever had broken. The 2 with the lung ailment were breathing more easily. Eric appeared at the infirmary door as the light was failing, took in the room with one sweep of those silver eyes, and looked at her. "You work fast," he said. "I work well," she corrected, without heat. His expression shifted again, that almost not-quite movement that she was beginning to think might be as close as he regularly got to a visible reaction. "Yes," he said. "You do." He left. She finished her notes on each patient, organized her supplies, and washed her hands at the basin in the corner. Outside the window, the sky was dark and full of stars, and the snow that had begun to fall was soft and without wind, settling over Whitecrest like a held breath. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at it. The pack grounds were quiet. A few wolves moved between buildings, their breath clouding in the cold. Somewhere across the courtyard, a door opened and closed, and she saw the white of Irik's hair briefly before he stepped into shadow. She did not understand what she had walked into. She did not know this place, or these people, or this king, who said exactly what he meant and nothing more, who had looked at her like he knew her before she had spoken a single word. She was still hurting, still carrying the weight of what had happened in that hall in Iron Peak, still feeling the echo of the broken bond in the deep places of her chest. But she was standing, she was working, she was in a place where no one had yet looked through her, and that felt, for now, like enough to build on. She turned from the window and went back to her patients. 2 days into her work at Whitecrest, the wolves who had been suspicious of her began to test her, the way any group of people tests a newcomer they are not sure about yet. They brought her small cases first, minor injuries and complaints, things they could have handled themselves, watching to see how she managed. She managed well, and without condescension, treating each case with the same complete attention she gave the serious ones. Word moved through the pack the way water moves through soil, quietly and thoroughly. By the end of the first week, the line outside the infirmary had grown noticeably longer, and the skepticism that had been in the eyes of the wolves who came to her had been replaced by something more practical: trust. Astrid was the last to shift, and she did not do it obviously. But Selene noticed when the beta started meeting her eyes in the corridors instead of looking past her. She noticed when Astrid started answering her questions about the pack's history without the edge she had initially carried in her voice. She noticed, one afternoon when a pack pup had fallen from a low wall and split her lip and was screaming in the way frightened children do, that Astrid had handed the child directly to Selene without hesitation, which was not a small thing. Irik watched all of this from a distance. That was what he did. She began to understand it as a quality of his. Not aloofness, but a particular kind of attention, the kind that does not announce itself, that moves quietly around the edges of a situation rather than into the center of it. He came to the infirmary each evening to check on the patients. He always asked her opinion before making any decision that touched on the health of his people. He never told her what to do. She found herself listening for his footsteps at the end of the day, without meaning to. It was not like what she had felt for Caden, which had been bright and urgent and loud in her chest from the very beginning, a fire that burned hot and offered warmth, but also, she understood now, left nothing standing once it ran out of fuel. What she began to feel around Irik was quieter than that, a steadiness, the sense of the ground being solid beneath her feet, something she had not had in years. She told herself it was gratitude. She had been through something that would have ended many people, and this place had given her room to breathe, and of course she felt warmly toward it, and toward the person who led it. That was all it was. But she was a healer. She knew bodies, and she knew what it meant when a person's heartbeat changed in response to the sound of another person's voice, the way hers did each evening when she heard Eric's quiet knock at the infirmary door. She chose not to think about it too carefully. She had enough to do. She always had enough to do. Then, on a Thursday in the 6th week of her time at Whitecrest, a wolf arrived from Iron Peak. He was young, nervous, and he asked for her by name. She came out to meet him in the courtyard with Astrid at her shoulder, and Eric standing 30 feet away near the gate, not intervening, only present. The young wolf handed her a folded letter. She did not need to open it to understand what it was. She could feel the shape of the situation before the words confirmed it. She opened it anyway. The letter was written in Caden's hand, Not formal pack language, not the careful language of an alpha addressing a former Luna, something rawer, something that might have moved her once. Lyra was dying. The illness that had seemed manageable had turned fast, the way some things do. She had been worsening for 2 weeks. Their own healers had exhausted their knowledge. There was no one in the region who had Selene's skill with the kind of deep tissue illness that had settled in Lyra's lungs. He was asking her to come back, not commanding, asking. She folded the letter and stood in the cold courtyard of Whitecrest, with the wind moving through the pines around the perimeter wall and the sound of the pack going about its daily life all around her. Astrid, beside her, said nothing. She was giving Selene room to think, and Selene appreciated that more than she could have said. She looked across the courtyard to where Eric stood, and he looked back at her, and he did not speak. He was waiting to see what she would do, and she understood that whatever she decided, he would not push her in either direction. He would tell her the truth of the situation if she asked for it. He would not make the choice for her. She turned to the young wolf from Iron Peak. "Tell him I need a day," she said. That evening she sat in the small room she had been given at Whitecrest, her healer's bag on the table in front of her, and she thought about what she was. She was someone who had been publicly set aside by the person she had trusted most in the world. She was someone who had walked 2 days through the cold with an open wound in her chest and had not stopped. She was someone who had come to a strange place, and within 6 weeks had become necessary to it, not because she needed to be needed, but because she was genuinely, practically, unmistakably good at her work. She was a healer. That was not something Caden had given her. It was not something he could take. It was hers, forged before she ever knew him, and it would be hers long after the last echo of what they had been to each other faded completely. She could refuse to go. No one would blame her. No one at Whitecrest would think less of her for it. Astrid would probably respect her more. But she would think less of herself, and that was the only ledger that had ever truly mattered to her. In the morning, she knocked on Eric's door. He opened it immediately, which told her he had not slept much either. He looked at her without surprise. "I am going," she said. "Not for him. For the work. I will be back when it is done." He studied her face for a long moment. Then he said, "I will have 2 wolves ready to travel with you within the hour." "I do not need protection," she said. "I know," he said, simply. "They are going for my peace of mind, not yours. If you find that unacceptable, I will withdraw the offer." She looked at him. The morning light was behind her, falling across the floor between them. She thought about what it had meant to be in a relationship with a man who had never once framed something as an offer he was willing to withdraw. "Send them," she said. She left for Iron Peak before noon, with 2 quiet Whitecrest wolves flanking her, and the weight of what waited ahead already settling across her shoulders. She did not look back at the gate when she left, but she felt it, the way you feel a place you have begun to love, in the specific pull at the center of the chest that tells you that you are leaving something worth returning to. She held that feeling carefully, like a small flame in her hands, all the way south. The road to Iron Peak was shorter going back than it had been going away. That was always the way. The journey towards something unknown takes longer because the mind has to work harder, measuring each step against the uncertainty ahead. The return trip moves differently. Selene knew exactly where she was going, and exactly what it would feel like to arrive. She had no uncertainty to cross, only the steady forward movement of someone who has already decided. The 2 wolves from Whitecrest traveled with her in silence, which she appreciated. Their names were Owen and Clara, and they were both young, professional, and completely uninterested in asking her questions she did not want to answer. They ate when she ate, rested when she indicated rest, and kept their attention on the road around them. She did not speak much, and they did not push her to. She spent the travel time thinking about Lyra. She had only seen the woman once, at a distance, in those last terrible days at Iron Peak. She had formed no opinion of her then, too caught up in the collapse of her own world to look carefully at the face of the person she had been replaced by. Now she tried to think about Lyra without the shape of pain around the thought. Lyra was human. She had come from somewhere outside pack life, outside the instincts and customs and hierarchies that governed everything Selene had grown up knowing. She had arrived in Iron Peak small and pale and overwhelmed, and Caden had chosen her, and that choice had destroyed 4 years of what Selene had believed her life to be. But Lyra had not made that choice. Caden had made it. Whatever Selene felt about the situation, none of it belonged on Lyra. She was a sick woman who needed help. That was the whole of what mattered now. They reached the Iron Peak border on the afternoon of the second day. The border wolves stepped back when they saw Selene, and she could see the mix of things in their faces: guilt, relief, a careful avoidance of meeting her eyes for too long. She walked through the territory she had known for 4 years, with her bag on her shoulder and her head level, and she did not look around at things that had once been familiar to her. She kept her eyes forward. Caden met her at the door of the main house. He looked worse than she had expected. There was a tiredness around his eyes that went deeper than missed sleep, the kind that came from carrying something too heavy for too long without being willing to put it down. He looked at her, and for a moment, something moved across his face that she did not try to read. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Where is she?" Selene said. He took her upstairs. Lyra was in the room that had once been Selene's. She noticed that immediately and chose not to think about it. The woman in the bed was smaller than she had looked from across a courtyard, fine-boned and very pale. Her dark hair spread out against the pillow, her breathing shallow in a way that told Selene immediately that they were not dealing with a simple lung ailment. This was something that had moved faster than it should have, and had settled deep. She set her bag on the table beside the bed and began her assessment without speaking. She listened to Lyra's breathing, checked her pulse, pressed careful fingers along the sides of her throat and down her ribs, asked quiet questions that Lyra answered in a thin, exhausted voice. Caden hovered near the door, and Selene did not acknowledge him. Lyra, for her part, looked up at Selene with eyes that were frightened and, beneath the fear, deeply ashamed. She knew who Selene was. She knew what it had cost Selene for Caden to bring her here. "I did not ask him to," Lyra said quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I told him not to." Selene glanced up at her. "That is not what I need to focus on right now," she said. "What I need is for you to breathe as slowly and deeply as you can while I work." "Can you do that?" Lyra nodded. Selene worked. The illness was a deep inflammation of the lung tissue, the kind that came from a body that had been pushed past its limits too many times and lacked the biological resilience of wolf physiology to recover on its own. A human body had no backup systems, no accelerated healing. It was fragile in ways that wolf healers were not always trained to account for. But Selene had treated human patients before, in border settlements where pack and human communities overlapped. She knew how to calibrate her methods. She worked carefully and thoroughly, using a combination of physical treatment and herbal preparations that she began immediately, noting in her mind the adjustments she would need to make over the following days. The following days were long. She slept in the room down the hall and came back every few hours through the night. She did not think about the fact that this house had once been her home. She did not think about the conversations that had happened in these rooms, the mornings and meals and ordinary moments that made up 4 years of shared life. She thought only about the work. Caden brought her food. He stood in doorways and watched her. Once, late on the second night, when Lyra had finally fallen into a proper sleep for the first time, he came to stand beside her in the corridor, and after a long silence, he said the things she had known he would say eventually. "I made a mistake." She did not respond immediately. She looked at the closed door of the room where Lyra slept. "Selene," he said, "I handled it wrong. All of it. I should have spoken to you first. I should not have done it the way I did, in public, in front of everyone." She turned to look at him then. He was earnest and tired, and not entirely without remorse, and she understood that. She did not doubt that some part of him meant what he said. But she had spent 2 months in a place where a man had told her the complete truth every single time he opened his mouth, and standing here now, she could hear all the things Caden's honesty was leaving out. He was not sorry he had chosen Lyra. He was sorry about how he had handled it. Those were 2 entirely different things. "Are you asking me to come back?" she said. He paused a moment too long. "I am saying I would consider it," he said. "Your position could be discussed." She heard it clearly. Not a man asking her to come home. A man offering to consider reinstating what he had taken. 2 different things. She understood the difference now in a way she had not fully understood it before she left. "I think," she said quietly, "that we both know that is not a good idea." He started to say something else. She shook her head once, gently. "Not now," she said. "Lyra needs sleep, and so do I. We can talk in the morning if you need to." She went to her room and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and let herself feel everything she had been holding back since she walked back into this territory. The grief that was still there, softer now, more like the ache of an old injury than the bright fury of a new one. The strange clarity of seeing something she had once wanted very badly and recognizing that she did not want it anymore, not because she had hardened, but because she had grown. She thought about the infirmary at Whitecrest. She thought about the elderly wolf who had said finally when she walked in. She thought about Astrid leaving food at the door without comment, which was as close to affection as Astrid apparently got. She thought about 6 wolves sitting in the dark of the infirmary each evening, silver eyes across the room, a low voice asking her opinion before any decision was made. She thought about a door opening in the early morning and the immediate certainty on the face of the man behind it, as though he had already known it would be her. She lay down and closed her eyes. On the 4th day, Lyra's breathing improved significantly. On the 5th, she was able to sit up and take proper meals. On the 6th, she was well enough to speak clearly and at length, and Selene sat with her for an hour and answered her questions honestly and without bitterness. And by the end of it, something had passed between them that neither of them quite had a name for. Not friendship, not absolution, something more practical than either. A mutual acknowledgement that they were both simply people who had been caught in the turbulence of someone else's choices and had come through it and were still here. "Thank you," Lyra said. "I know what it cost you to come." "It cost me less than you might think," Selene said, and she meant it. On the morning of the 7th day, she packed her bag, went downstairs, and told Caden that Lyra would recover fully, with proper rest and the continued use of the herbal preparation she was leaving behind, with careful written instructions. Caden walked her to the door. He was quiet in a way that told her he had processed their conversation from the night several days ago and had arrived at the same place she had, which was the right place, which was simply that it was over, and it had been over for longer than either of them had admitted. At the door, he said, "Take care of yourself." She looked at him. For the last time, she let herself look at him, the way she once had, just briefly, just enough to acknowledge what had been real between them, the things that had genuinely been good before they fell apart. Then she let that look go. "You too," she said. She walked out into the cold morning air of Iron Peak for the last time, and Owen and Clara fell into step beside her without a word, and the 3 of them headed north. She made it perhaps 2 miles past the Iron Peak border before her body decided it was done. The healer's work she had poured out over 7 days, the physical cost of treating a serious illness in a patient whose physiology she had to constantly compensate for, the accumulated weight of being in that place and carrying all that she had carried there, it all arrived at once, and her legs simply stopped cooperating. She sat down heavily at the base of a large pine tree and did not quite manage to keep her head up. Owen and Clara moved toward her immediately, and she heard Clara's voice, calm and practical, saying something into the wind. She heard the word king, and she heard an unfamiliar word that she understood. In the last clear moment before exhaustion pulled her under, was the name of a specific kind of emergency call, the kind that meant, "Come yourself." She woke in a moving carriage, wrapped in something so warm and heavy, it took her a moment to recognize it as a fur cloak, white and clean, and smelling of pine and cold air. The motion was smooth, the interior was dim. She turned her head and found Eirik sitting across from her, watching her with that particular steady attention of his, a cup of something warm held between his hands. She looked at him for a long moment. "You came yourself," she said. "Yes," he said. "You could have sent someone." "I could have," he agreed. She thought about that, about what it meant that he had not, about the distance between Whitecrest and the Iron Peak border, and how long he had been traveling to reach her. About the fact that he was here now, sitting in this carriage, in the early morning cold, looking at her with that face that gave almost nothing away, and somehow said everything. "Is this your cloak?" she asked. "It is yours now," he said, "if you want it." She pulled it closer around herself, and closed her eyes again, not from exhaustion this time, but from something that felt very much like relief. The specific relief of arriving in a place where you are expected and welcome, and nothing is being asked of you right now, except that you rest. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," he said quietly, and did not say anything else. and the carriage moved steadily north through the winter morning, carrying her home. The road back to Whitecrest felt nothing like the road away from it. Selene had left Whitecrest carrying the weight of a task that needed doing. She returned wrapped in a white cloak in a moving carriage, with Eric across from her, and the deep quiet of the winter forest on all sides. And what she felt was not the careful relief of someone who had survived something difficult, but the deeper stillness of someone who had come through it, changed, and was only now beginning to understand how. She slept most of the journey. Ariak did not seem to mind. When she woke for the second time, the sky outside the small carriage window was the pale silver of late afternoon, and the trees around them were the tall, dense pines of Whitecrest's outer border, and she knew they were close. She sat up and straightened the cloak around her, and found Eric watching her with that expression she was still learning to read, the one that was not quite neutral, but was too contained to name. He had maps spread across his knee that he had clearly been studying while she slept, and she had the feeling that he had been doing two things at once, working and watching over her, and had seen no contradiction between them. "How long was I asleep?" she asked. "Most of the day," he said. He folded the maps and set them aside. "Are you hungry?" She was. Extremely. She had not eaten properly in 2 days. He produced bread and dried meat from a bag by his feet and handed it across without ceremony, and she ate in the unself-conscious way of someone too hungry to perform anything. And he returned to his maps, and the carriage moved through the last miles of the journey in a comfortable quiet that she did not want to disturb, and that he showed no inclination to disturb either. When the carriage passed through the gates of Whitecrest, the pack knew. She could feel the shift in the energy around the compound, the settling of something that had been slightly taut during her absence. Wolves appeared in doorways and at corners, not dramatically, not in the way of a formal welcome, but the way a community notices when one of its own has returned. Astrid met them in the courtyard. She looked at Selene with the thorough, evaluative gaze that was simply Astrid's way of showing she had been paying attention, and something softened slightly in the beta's face. "The elderly male in the infirmary has been asking for you since yesterday," Astrid said. "I told him you were resting." "I will go in the morning," Selene said. Astrid nodded. She glanced at Eirik briefly, a look that passed between them in a second, and contained, Selene suspected, more communication than most people managed in a full conversation. Then she turned and went back about her work. Selene went to her room and slept a full night without dreaming. In the following days, something changed in Whitecrest. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to and named easily, but Selene felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, in the body rather than the mind. The pack treated her differently, not with more respect exactly, because they had already given her that through the evidence of her work. Something else, something warmer. She understood it gradually, the way she came to understand most things about Whitecrest, through observation rather than instruction. While she had been gone, the pack had been watching Eirik. They had watched him get the call from Owen and leave himself, immediately, without delegating, without hesitation. They had watched him return with her, in his own carriage, wrapped in his own cloak. And they had drawn their conclusions in the way that communities draw conclusions, quietly and collectively, and the conclusion had settled over Whitecrest, like the snow that continued to fall every third or fourth day, clean and thorough and covering everything evenly. They thought she belonged here, not as a healer who had been taken in, as something more. She was not sure what to do with that. She thought about it one evening, while she was restocking the infirmary shelves, organizing her supplies with the methodical attention she always gave the task, when the door opened, and Eirik came in at his usual hour. She had come to mark the days partly by this, the evening visit, the quiet questions about her patients, the few minutes of conversation that were more substantive than their brevity should have allowed. He looked at the shelves she was organizing, and then at her. "Sit down," he said, which was unusual. He normally waited for an invitation to take up space in a room she was working in. She sat on the edge of the table and looked at him. He took the chair by the door and did not speak immediately, which was also unlike him, because when Eric Vane was not speaking, it was usually because he was deciding exactly what to say, not because he was struggling to find words. Then he said, "I owe you something I have not yet given you." She waited. "When you arrived at Whitecrest," he said, "I recognized you. Not your name or your face, Something else. I want to be honest with you about what that was. She felt the thing in her chest that she had been carefully not examining since the night in the carriage, the thing that had been growing quieter and steadier and more present, like a light that had been gradually brightening in a room she had been pretending not to look into. The bond of the vein line, he said, is not fated in the way most bonds are. It does not arrive suddenly. It is not a certainty from the first moment. It is a recognition, a direction, the sense of a door that has always been there, and the awareness that it is now possible to open it. He looked at her steadily. I am not telling you this to ask anything of you. I am telling you because I told you once that I speak honestly, and I have not been fully honest in this. She looked at him for a long time. How long have you known? She asked. Since the night you arrived, he said. Since you walked into this room and told me you were one of the best healers I would find, without apology. She almost smiled at that. Almost. And you said nothing, she said. You had just had your bond broken, he said. You had just walked 2 days through the cold. You had come here with nothing, and were being asked to trust a complete stranger. What you needed was time, and room, and a fair exchange of work for shelter. Not a king telling you he had recognized something in you before you had spoken 10 words. He paused. That is not how I am. No, she thought. It was not how he was. She was beginning to understand very precisely how he was, and it was unlike anything she had been given before. She slid off the table and stood, and he watched her, and she crossed the small space between them, and crouched slightly so their eyes were level, and she looked at him very directly. I need you to understand something, she said. Yes, he said. I am not choosing this because I am lonely, or grateful, or looking for something to replace what I lost. I spent months here working, and watching, and being treated like a person whose choices matter, and what I feel for you has grown in the only way I trust anymore, which is slowly and clearly and based on who you have actually been, not who I needed you to be. She held his gaze. Are we clear on that? Completely, he said, and in his voice was the same quality she had been learning to hear, the warmth that did not announce itself, but ran all the way through what he said, like heat through stone. She straightened. She nodded once. All right, she said. Then we can talk about what comes next. What came next was not a sudden thing. It was not a declaration in front of the pack, or a ceremony organized on short notice, or any kind of spectacle. It was a series of evenings spent in conversation that went longer than either of them planned. It was Eirik walking her through the history carved into the frames of every door in Whitecrest, explaining what the markings meant, giving her the language of the place that had become her home. It was Selene teaching him the names of herbs he had used imprecisely for years, and the specific logic of her system of organization, and watching his face as he catalogued everything she told him with the careful attention of someone who intended to remember. It was the morning she arrived at the infirmary and found that someone had built a second shelf along the far wall overnight, exactly the height she had mentioned once, weeks ago, would be useful. She had not asked for it. She had not even been sure she had said it loud enough to be heard. She had simply mentioned it in passing, and it had been done. She stood in front of it for a moment and felt something arrive quietly in her chest, not the bright consuming rush that she had once mistaken for love, but something more like the feeling of coming in from a long, cold walk and finding the fire already lit. Someone had been paying attention. Someone had acted on what they noticed. Not to impress her, simply because it was useful to her, and that was reason enough. She went to find him. He was at the long table in his workroom, maps again, always maps, the territorial awareness of a king who had been responsible for a great deal of land for a very long time. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. The shelf, she said. He looked at her without pretending not to know what she meant. You mentioned it 2 weeks ago, he said. I know, she said. Thank you. He nodded. He started to look back down at his maps. Eirik, she said. He looked up again. She crossed the room, and she stood in front of him, and she said, I am staying, not as your healer. I am staying as your match, if that is still what you are offering. I would like for it to be official. The thing that moved across his face then was not the controlled almost expression she had been watching and learning for months. It was something much simpler and much more complete. He stood up. He was tall when he stood, and she had to look up at him slightly, and she did not mind that. He looked at her for a moment with everything visible that was usually kept quiet. "It is what I am offering," he said. "Good," she said. The bonding ceremony was held on a quiet evening with the pack gathered, but without formality, without the kind of performance that announces itself as history while it is happening. The elders led the words. Astrid stood at Eirik's shoulder, looking fierce and proud in equal measure. The pup who had fallen from the wall and split her lip 3 months ago stood at the front of the crowd and watched with enormous, serious eyes. When the bond formed, it was not like the tearing, it was not like the Iron Peak bond, which had always felt like two separate things held together under pressure. The Whitecrest bond settled into her, like something finding the place it had always been meant to be, like water filling the exact shape of its vessel, like a door opening into a room where the fire had always been lit and the warmth had always been there, waiting for the right person to walk in. She stood beside Eirik in the quiet of the evening, their hands joined, the snow beginning to fall again, and she felt the entirety of what had been built over these months, not just between them, but between her and this place, this pack, this cold and ancient territory that had become hers as much as it was his. She was not the person who had walked through the gates in the dark of a winter night, with nothing but her bag and her stubbornness. She was not the person who had stood in that Iron Peak hall and held herself upright while the floor fell away beneath her feet. She was those people still, she carried them, but she was also this, a healer with full standing, and a shelf built to the right height, and a king who remembered everything she said and acted on it without announcement. She was home. 3 days after the bonding ceremony, the peace of Whitecrest was broken by the arrival of a rider at the gates bearing the Iron Peak sigil. Selene was in the infirmary when Astrid came to find her, and one look at Astrid's face told her the news was not routine. She followed the beta out to the courtyard, where the rider stood with his horse and tried to look composed in the way that young wolves do when they are very much not composed. Caden was coming. He was already on his way. He had heard about the bonding, and from the description the rider gave, carefully worded and stripped of direct quotes, Caden had not received the news with grace. Selene stood in the courtyard with the cold morning air around her, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, not even apprehension, a very clear, very steady sense of the shape of things, of where she stood, and what that meant, and how small the thing coming toward her actually was, compared to where she had been, and what she had survived to get here. She went to find Eirik. He already knew. He had people at the Whitecrest borders who communicated in ways she was still learning about, and he had received word an hour before the rider arrived. He was in his workroom when she found him, not with his maps this time, but standing at the window, looking out at the compound with that particular quality of stillness he had when something was being decided. He turned when she came in. "I know," she said, before he could speak. "What do you want to do?" "I would like to meet him at the border," Eirik said. "Alone. No display of force. I think that is the correct approach." She thought about that. "He will read it as weakness," she said. "He will read it as confidence," Eirik said. "Weakness surrounds itself with warriors. Confidence walks to the gate by itself." He looked at her steadily. "This is not a situation that requires fighting, Selene. It requires being very clear." She understood that. She understood it on the same level that she had understood, in the Iron Peak Hall that night, that the way to maintain her dignity was not to argue, but to leave without argument. There was a kind of clarity that was more powerful than force, because it could not be disputed by force, only met with something equal, and what Caden would bring to those gates was fury, which was not equal to clarity. "All right," she said, "but I am coming with you." He had not expected that. She saw it in the brief pause before he said, "You do not have to." "I know," she said. "I am coming anyway. He needs to see it for himself, and I need to be there when he does." Caden arrived at the Whitecrest gates in the mid-afternoon, with 12 Iron Peak wolves at his back, which was not a war party, but was significantly more than a courtesy visit. He was riding, which meant he had been moving fast, which meant the fury had not cooled during the journey. Eirik walked to the gate and opened it himself. Caden pulled his horse up short at the sight of him. The 12 wolves behind him stopped. The afternoon was very quiet. The snow had stopped falling that morning, and the sky was the pale, cloudless blue of deep winter, and everything was very still. Selene stood 3 paces behind Eirik's right shoulder. She did not step forward, She did not step back. Caden looked past Eirik and saw her. His face did the thing she had seen it do in the Iron Peak Hall. Not cruelty, not triumph, something more complicated, and, she thought, more honest. This time, though, it was not relief. It was the expression of a man who has pushed something away, and then reached for it again, and found it had moved entirely beyond his reach, and is being forced to understand the permanence of that in real time. Selene, he said. Caden, she said. Eric said nothing. He simply stood at the gate and waited, with the complete and unperformable patience of someone who has been doing difficult things for a very long time, and has no need to rush any of them. Caden looked at Eric. He was trying to find something to work with, some angle or leverage, the way alphas look for, when they walk into a situation they have not fully controlled. He found none. The bonding, Caden said. He kept his voice steady with visible effort. It was done without notice, without consultation. It was done correctly, Eirik said, simply, by the customs of Whitecrest, which are the only customs that apply on this territory. She was my Luna, Caden said. She was, Eirik said. You released her. That was your decision and your right. She came north and built a life here of her own choice and her own work, and she entered into this bond of her own free will, as she will tell you herself if you ask her directly. He paused, and Selene heard in that pause not a threat, but a line being drawn with precision. What she is now is my match and the Queen of Whitecrest, and Whitecrest is protected by alliances that extend significantly beyond what Iron Peak can bring to these gates. Caden sat on his horse and said nothing. The 12 wolves behind him were very still. I am not looking for conflict with Iron Peak, Eric said. I have no quarrel with you. What I am telling you is the reality of this situation, plainly, so there is no room for misunderstanding. His voice was the same, even unhurried tone it always was. No anger, no performance. Just clarity, exactly as he had said. Go home, Caden. Take care of your people. That is enough. Caden's gaze moved to Selene again. She met it. He was looking for hesitation, for the flicker of something that would tell him there was still a thread he could pull. She had nothing to hide. She let him look, and she let him find exactly what was there, which was a woman who was settled in herself, and in where she stood, not against him, simply complete in a way that no longer had anything to do with him. He looked for a long time. Then he turned his horse. He did not speak again. He rode south, and his wolves rode with him, and the sound of the hooves moved away down the road and faded into the winter quiet, and they were gone. Eric turned. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He will not return, Eirik said. No, she agreed. He will not. They walked back through the gates together. Astrid was waiting in the courtyard, with the carefully neutral expression she wore, when she was relieved, but would not say so. Several pack members were visible at doors and windows, having watched from a respectful distance. No one spoke immediately. There was simply the collective breath of a community that had watched something be handled well and was satisfied. Selene felt the weight of it all, not as a burden, but as a kind of gravity. The pleasant pull of a place that now held her fully, and from all directions. She thought of where she had been a year ago, in a hall full of people watching her be erased. She thought of the long walk north in the dark. She thought of the 2 days of walking, and the base of the pine tree, and the floor of the cold forest, and getting back up anyway. She thought about all the things that had to break, and all the cold she had to walk through to arrive at this gate, at this courtyard, at this life. The elderly male she had cured in the infirmary in those first weeks appeared from the direction of the building, moving more easily now than he had in a long time, his sharp eyes finding her across the yard. He nodded at her with the simple satisfaction of someone who had been right about something important and was taking quiet pleasure in being proved correct. She nodded back. Eirik was standing at her shoulder. She was aware of his warmth at her side, the specific quality of his presence, steadying and close, and entirely uncomplicated in its care for her. She turned slightly and looked up at him. Thank you, she said, and he knew she did not mean only this afternoon. There is nothing to thank me for, he said, and she knew he meant it entirely, that it was not modesty, but simply how he understood the world, that taking care of the people you have chosen, and who have chosen you, was not something that required gratitude, because it was simply what you did. She took a breath of the cold Whitecrest air. pine and stone and deep snow. Somewhere over the mountains, the sky was beginning to go the pale gold of late winter afternoon, and the compound was warm with light and life and the particular smell of a large pack that has been together long enough to know each other deeply. She thought about the story she had been told by Elder Brant at the edge of Iron Peak territory, in the dark, on a night she had thought was the worst of her life, about a woman who would arrive from the south in winter with nothing but her hands and her purpose, about waiting. She understood what it was to wait for something without knowing its shape, carrying the hope of it through a long season of cold. She understood what it was to walk towards something unknown and find it exactly as substantial as the most careful and honest part of you had suspected it might be. The small pup appeared from around the side of the infirmary building, running with the artless speed of a child who has somewhere to be and no reason to move any more quietly. She nearly ran directly into Selene's legs. She looked up, caught herself, grinned with the gap-toothed brightness of a child who is not often embarrassed, and said something in the rapid, breathless way of children with news. Astrid says dinner is ready, and if you do not come now, she will eat your portion. Selene looked at Eric. Eric looked at her. She would absolutely do that, he said. I know, Selene said. She took the pup's hand, and they walked across the courtyard toward the long dining hall, where the light from the windows was warm and gold against the deepening blue of the evening, and the sound of the pack at dinner was the particular comfortable noise of many people gathered around one table, and somewhere inside Astrid was almost certainly guarding her portion with territorial conviction. Ulrich walked beside her. He did not take her hand. He did not need to. She was aware of him the way she had become aware of this place, as the ground beneath her feet, reliable, and present, and hers. She pushed open the dining hall door, and the warmth and noise came out to meet her, and she walked in. She did not look back at the gate. There was nothing behind her she needed anymore. Everything she had ever been was still there, inside her, the healer, the loyal one, the woman who had gotten up from the cold ground and kept walking when most would have stayed down. All of it was hers to keep. And everything ahead of her was this. She sat down at the long table, in the seat that had become hers, in the pack that had become hers, in the life she had built with her own hands and her own courage from the ruins of a night she had believed was the end of her. It had not been the end. It had been the beginning of the only story that had ever been truly meant for her. She picked up her fork. Astrid, across the table, looked at her with something that was as close to warmth as Astrid was willing to be publicly. You took long enough, Astrid said. I always get where I am going, Selene said. And that, completely and without reservation, was the truth.